In this lesson, we're going to go over the characteristics of a good experiment. In an experiment, we often divide our samples into a control group and experimental groups. The experimental group is the group that receives the treatment, while the control group does not receive the treatment. If you think about the demonstration I did with the vinegar and the Alka-Seltzer, I wasn't doing a good experiment. And that's because I didn't have a control group. The control group would have been 100 milliliters of vinegar from the same bottle that I just didn't drop the Alka-Seltzer into. So we would treat the control group and the experimental groups almost the exact same. The only thing that would have been different is that the experimental group would have received the Alka-Seltzer tablet while the control group didn't. And just something to note the way I run my classroom, when we're doing notes from a PowerPoint or other sources, usually the stuff in red are the things that I would suggest you write down and copy into your notebook. Sometimes the stuff in black is just kind of things that I would like for us to talk about as a class. So the stuff in red, or sometimes it's green or blue if I just want to mix it up a little bit. The colorful stuff, that's what you want to get down in your notebook. Also, at the top of your notes, each day when you take notes, I like for you to put the date. So go ahead and put today's date up there at the top of the page when you take notes. All right, so getting back to this stuff. What's the purpose of a control group? The purpose of a control group is to minimize the unintended influence of other variables on the same system. So some of you might have wondered, maybe the vinegar is just dropping in temperature because it's so cold in your classroom. Well, we can't prove that one way or another because I didn't do a good experiment. I didn't have my control group. But if I repeated the experiment and I had just a beaker of vinegar sitting there, I would be able to prove that it stayed the same temperature while the Alka-Seltzer and vinegar mixture dropped, and that would help me have a little bit more evidence that the Alka-Seltzer was in fact making the temperature drop. Here's another example. If I did an experiment where I tested the effect of sugar water on plant growth, what would I do to the experimental groups versus what would I do to the control groups, or control group? Well, for the experimental groups, I could dissolve various amounts of sugar in the water that I gave them. So I might give one plant 1 gram of sugar in 100 milliliters of water. I might give another plant 2 grams of sugar in 100 milliliters of water. So I could have multiple experimental groups. And then the control group would just get pure water. So the control group still gets water, but it just wouldn't get any sugar in it. No treatment. The variables in an experiment is what we'll talk about next. We have the independent variable, dependent variable, and then you have controlled variables. So that word control appears again here, but again, we've got two vocabulary words with the word control in them. We were just talking about the control group, which is the group that doesn't receive the treatment. Here we're going to talk about controlled variables, which is a different vocabulary term to keep up with. Well, first of all, the independent variable. That's the factor that you purposefully change, and we would put that typically on the x-axis, which I'll show you in a second. Next, the dependent variable is the response. So if you think about cause and effect, not always, but oftentimes the independent variable is the cause, and the dependent variable is the effect. For instance, as I added more sugar to the water, maybe the plant grew taller and taller and taller. The sugar added to the water would be the independent variable, while the dependent variable might be the height the plant grew. Finally, controlled variables. The controlled variables are the factors that are kept the same for all groups. So if I did that experiment with the different plants, with the plants that got sugar water versus those that got plain water, I would want to make sure that they were the same species of plant, that they got the same amount of sunlight every day, that they were kept in the same temperature conditions. Those would be the factors that I kept the same, and so we call those the controlled variables. So independent and dependent variables have these words independent and dependent. Why do we call them that? And that's because typically in an experiment, the dependent variable depends upon the independent variable. Let's think about some relationships. The time for a download depends on the speed of your internet. Well, the time for a download depends on something, so it's the dependent variable. And then the speed of the internet is the independent variable. So the time for a download depends upon the speed of the internet, but it wouldn't make sense to say that the speed of the internet depends on the time for a download. And so that can kind of help you figure out which one's which, if you write it as a sentence in terms of depends. Here's another. The amount of money you make depends on the number of hours you work. That should say you work. Again, the amount of money is dependent upon how many hours you work. But the number of hours you work does not depend on the amount of money you make. That doesn't make sense. When you graph data, typically you're going to put your dependent variable on the y-axis, and your independent variable will go on the x-axis. Your dependent variable on the y-axis, that's the vertical axis, and then your independent variable on the x-axis, your horizontal axis. So go ahead and sketch that out so you know how that's going to look when you make graphs later on in the class. And then I've got a way for you to remember that. The x-axis, well, an x has 4 corners to it, so it's independent with 4 syllables to that word. And then the y-axis is dependent, and it's got 3 syllables for dependent, just like the y has kind of 3 corners or 3 points on it. So that's just a way you can remember that. Finally, the nature of these relationships. We have a directly proportional relationship when one variable increases and the other variable increases proportionally. And so this corresponds to the amount of money you make depending on the number of hours you work. The more hours you work, the more money you make. One variable increases, the other variable increases. On the other hand, another type of relationship is called inversely proportional relationship. In this case, when one variable increases, the other variable decreases. This is the typical shape of an inversely proportional relationship. Some people want it to be a straight line with a negative slope, but it actually has a curve to it, just like this. And so this corresponds when we said the time for a download to finish depends on the speed of the internet. As the speed of the internet gets faster and faster and faster, the time for a download becomes less and less and less. So one variable goes up and the other variable goes down. And we do have a negative slope to this line, but it's just curved. It's not necessarily a straight line. All right, well, in your experiment, you're going to be focusing on independent, dependent, and controlled variables mostly. So I just wanted to get you started with this, and then you'll be working on it on your own in a separate assignment file that you'll see on Canvas. But I wanted to make sure you read through it, so we're going to read through it together, the intro. What is measured during a controlled experiment? Then it says why. Working in the science lab can be a lot of fun. Mixing random chemicals and burning stuff just to see what happens can be entertaining and possibly dangerous, but it doesn't lead to anything helpful to the scientific community. In order to be helpful to the community, a researcher's work in the lab must be systematic. A researcher usually asks a question and then designs an experiment to investigate that question. In this activity, you will identify types of variables that will help you design controlled experiments. And then it gets kind of full circle to that Alka-Seltzer and vinegar demo that we looked at earlier. So once again, that's the end of notes. On Canvas, you're going to see your assignment that you're going to be working on that goes along with this paragraph that we just read. Thanks a lot for listening, and I hope you have a great day.